The open window. My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall said in a very self-possessed young lady of 15. In the meantime, you must try and put up with me. Franton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something which should duty flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much towards helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. I know it will be, his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. You will bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerve will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice. Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. Do you know many of the people around here? Asked the niece, when she judged that they had sufficient silent communication. Hardly a soul, said Frampton. My sister was staying here at the rectory, you know, some for years ago, and gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here. He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, pursued the self-possessed young lady. Only her name and address, admitted the caller, which is Frampton. He was wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was in the married or widowed state, and undefiably something about the room seemed to suggest a masculine habitation. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago, said the child. That would be since your sister's time. Her tragedy? Asked Frampton. Somehow, in his restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. Oh, you wonder why we keep that window wide open on a Sunday on an October afternoon, said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened into the lawn. It's quite warm for the time of year, said Frampton. But what has that window got to do with the tragedy? Paragraph 14. Out through that window 3 years ago to a day, her husband and her two young brothers went off for a days of shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, there were all three engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, you know, and places that were safe in other years gave way to suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Hear the child's voice, lost in self possessed note, and became faltering human. Poor Aunt always thinks that they will come back someday. They and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walked in that window just as they used to. That is why the window is kept open every evening until it's quite dusk. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arms, and Ronnie, her younger brother, singing Bertie, why do you bound? As always did to tease her, because she said it got to her nerves. Do you know something on still quiet evenings like this? I almost get a creepy feeling that they'll walk through that window. Next page. She broke off with a little shudder. It was relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has amused you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Stapleton whiskily. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come this way. They've been out for snipes in the marsh today, so they'll make a fine mess over my more poor carpets. So like you men folk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and scarcity of birds and the prospect of duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but one partially successful effort to talk on a less ghastly topic. He was conscious that his hostess was giving him only fragments of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window and the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. The doctors agreed and ordered me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise, announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintance are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet, there are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No," said Mrs. Stapleton, in a voice only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into her alert attention, but not to what Franklin was saying. "Here they are at last!" she cried, "just in time for tea. Don't they look as if they were muddy up to the eyes?" Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards his niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill of shock, nameless fear, Frampton swung around in his seat and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, three figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They are all carrying guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulder. He tried a tired brown spaniel kept close to their heels. Noiselessly, they reared neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk. "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly to his stick and hat. The the hall door, the gravel drive, the front way gate were the dingy, noted stage of his heading retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid an intimate collision. Paragraph 26. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming through the window, "fairly muddy, but most of it's dry. Who was it that bolted out as we came up?" "A most extraordinary man." "Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Stapleton. "We could only talk about his illness, and he dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once hunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Granger by a pack of piranha dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grimacing and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerves." Romance, a short notice, was her specialty. The